Hi, I'm Mike Hunnicky. Welcome again to Red Flags Rising. I'm the co-chair of Hugh Subin Reed's Sanctions, Export Controls, and AML Practice. With me, as always, is Brent Carlson, the director at the Berkeley Research Group. And we have a special guest with us today, Erika Trujillo of SEIA. Erika, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you so much, Mike and Brent, for having me. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. I have a little bit of a 360-degree background on trade compliance. My career started with the U.S. Department of Commerce in D.C. I've been a trade compliance officer myself for many years in the German automotive industry. I've also been a lawyer in private practice, and now I'm on the innovation side of trade compliance tech. What I've been working on is bringing advanced data analytics to our industry. As the geopolitical situation has been changing, I think we can all agree there's been a lot of challenges. So together with a group of amazing trade compliance officers and technical people, we really thought about how we can also deliver some innovation and solutions to meet those challenges in today's world. Thank you for having me, and I'm so delighted to be speaking with you guys today.
Erika, this is your own firm that you started a few years ago, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I was one of the original two co-founders of SEIA. We launched about 3 years ago in Munich, Germany, though of course now we are supporting clients globally. We were looking to figure out a way that we can help trade compliance departments meet the changing demands that we have on our organizations. One of the trends we've been discussing at length for the past few years is really how we're seeing a lot more kind of proactive and strategic demands on a trade compliance department, but quite often they don't really have the infrastructure to meet those questions and bring answers to the organization. So we thought, how can we use data analytics to really help trade compliance departments bring value to the business by getting an oversight of what's going on within their organization, be able to really identify risks in real time, and change the way that we think about risk assessments to be a little bit more operational and proactive focused.
Well, that last point, Erica, is a really great point. It's something we see as a huge need. How do you actually calibrate a risk assessment when more and more things are just being thrown into the trade compliance bucket? What are some of the things that are useful in terms of thinking about how to draw that line from a risk assessment perspective?
That's been an ongoing question, and it certainly changed as we saw our business processes become more digital. This was one of the first catalysts for why we saw the need for something new in our industry, and I'm sure in your legal experience you've seen this as well. What is considered knowledge and what is data and what is evidence is an ever-evolving topic. We saw this with some of the Bittrex cases where they were being held liable for knowing or should have known that they had red flags because of the IP addresses of some of the people accessing their sites. And I remember when those cases came out, I was in trade compliance myself, and I was thinking, okay, I didn't even know this kind of data existed. Does my company have this data? Do I need to suddenly be responsible for this and looking for that? That was a huge wake-up call for me because I had to put my ego aside a bit to say, my human being level of awareness does not equal company knowledge. If somebody calls my sales guy and says, hey, we want to sell this to Iran, can you give us your products? And they don't call and tell me that, it doesn't mean the red flag doesn't exist. The same is very true for data, and more so now that we're seeing this push to digitalization. This, in my mind, has had a huge impact on the way we think about our risk assessments. We really need to be thinking about how do we take a risk-based approach, but actually know what our real operational risks are. For that, it always comes down to understanding the business and understanding the data.
Totally. And, we're in a world where things are moving very rapidly. And I think Brent and I have the view that's already moved from what was maybe misperceived from a legacy perspective of trade being kind of a administrative paper, obviously now digital, but check the box almost type of operation to one where, as you said, wait a second, my company's knowledge is not just what I know. It's not just what the sales team knows. It's what we both know. We see that across a wide variety of regulatory environments. In the US, we call it the collective knowledge doctrine, whether it's reason to know in the context of OFAC, whether it is the high probability standard or reason to know in the world of export controls, whether it's those same high probability standards in the inbound rule, ICTS for the US, the outbound investment rule of Treasury. Everything's moving to this world where that's exactly how you have to think. It's not just what is sitting on your laptop in front of you. What does your company know, and knowledge being defined as a full definition of knowledge to include all these definitions that were really designed many years ago to specifically make it difficult to have plausible deniability or willful blindness.
Mike, I would love to also hear your thoughts, or Brent, of course, yours as well, on a distinction that I often like to make between what I call internal and external data. A lot of people, when they start talking about red flags and they're discussing, how far should we go in due diligence, they're really thinking about how they engage with that external data. How far do I need to go in the Google search or these connected charts, right, of ownership? But there's a big difference in my mind between information you didn't find when you went out looking for it versus internal information or internal data that's sitting within your own company. It already exists, especially when we get into the legal discussion of what is or isn't knowledge. I see a big distinction there, and I would love to hear your take on this.
Quite often, we see the answers are hidden in plain sight. Companies actually sit on a lot more information than they may think they have. It may be distributed throughout the enterprise in a fashion where it may not be fully collected either. I think you make a really good point in understanding the business and what's driving that. Where could be some of those more riskier sales channels, and then understanding where's the data internally that goes with it. Because also, you need internal and external data. You need both to calibrate each other. Otherwise, it's taking information in a vacuum. Once you can triangulate that, I think you get to a pretty good picture.
Well said, Brent. I think the other thing, Erika, that we worry about, clients and companies worry about as well, is to your point about external versus internal. External data is really self-certified. You're essentially asking, for example, for an end-use certificate, and it looks great. It's got a good title on it. Somebody signs it. Maybe multiple people sign it. But at the end of the day, it's a self-certification. Getting to the point where you can leverage data you have that maybe you couldn't previously leverage, that is way more reliable, and maybe it's way more insightful because it's dynamic, it's holistic. You can see across the business where you need to. You certainly can see across time where you need to.
You highlight so many points. In my head, immediately two things come to mind. First is contextualization, and the second is prioritization. First, on the contextualization side, the difficult thing with early data analytics was being able to put what is sometimes interesting but not very informative information into context of the business. We saw a really interesting scenario with one of our clients where we highlighted for them that one of their core drivers of circumvention was a particular EAR 99 item going from Brazil to Paraguay. And they came back and they're like, oh, there's something wrong with your solution because, it's EAR 99. This is a company that does direct business with Russia still legally. They do business with all of the different transshipment countries. They're chock full of dual use items. So they're like, no, of course not. What's going on here, right? And we looked at it, we said, no, this particular item on this particular trade route is getting a lot of risk indicators in your own data. Things like an international border market was the end user on some of the transactions, the high volume increase of these components that were being ordered after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was a brand new customer on this supply route. There wasn't an installed base for some of the components. Some of the components were on the HS codes subject to Russia sanctions. These trends, when you start to see them all together and the lowest common denominator is this little EAR 99 item, suddenly you start asking, why is this interesting? They were able to discuss with their engineers and understand what was going on. It turns out that that particular item was likely a viable substitute for dual-use items. It highlights one of the trends we're often being told by regulators, which is we get so focused on the dual-use items, we forget that a lot of the items that are being found on the battlefields are, completely innocuous things, but suddenly when you put them in this context, it becomes really insightful. You need to engage with the red flags. You need to look at the data, because if you're just looking at Kazakhstan and you're just looking at the dual-use items, you might actually miss the very real potential circumvention scenario, because out of context, it's very difficult to identify that kind of trend.
That's a really good point. The triggers for a license are not just whether it has an ECCN. There are end use and end user provisions that trigger that requirement. People, sometimes they forget that. They go, oh, it's ER 99, it's no problem. But no. It was a really good story about unpacking that a bit and seeing that, oh, actually it is, even from a technical perspective, it's a readily available substitute for an item that's on the Commerce Control List. So that's an interesting story too, and how to using data and how to sort of unpack this a bit.
Of course. And Mike, you made a comment earlier I liked where you said, the internal data is more reliable, and it is more reliable in the sense that it's your data. But what we often see with companies is actually their data is terribly unreliable because they're often lacking a lot of data. The data quality is a challenge. That was true in my day as a trade compliance officer. We had 37 different ERP systems and Excel spreadsheet rogue warriors and places without internet. But one of the things that we see is a lot of companies are hesitant hesitant to engage with their data and engage with these kind of processes because they say, well, I have terrible data quality. One of the things we see the most often across all of the companies that we work with, the number of US origin items missing US ECCNs in the master data, meaning that US re-export license determination process just never happens. If you're only having the small view as the trade compliance officer, you think you've caught it all because everything with that US ECCN is triggering this process. But what about those items that are literally stored in your system as US origin that never get that trigger? Or maybe you're importing a particular product, let's say into Europe from the US. You only have imports from the US of that particular component, yet you're exporting it without these classifications. Sometimes the risk that we need to be measuring in these kind of risk assessments isn't always necessarily the regulatory risk exposure. It's quite often the operational risk exposure coming from these kind of root causes like data governance, suspicious third-party behavior, things like that. They're not as cool as the big circumvention topics, but quite often they have the biggest impact on the operational processes of the company that we see.
If someone listening is in a smaller company, maybe mid-sized company, what's a way for them to think about how to gradually enter into this type of analysis step by step?
That's such a good question because I think especially the medium-sized companies are the ones most often overlooked. They're really the ones where you maybe have one person who's responsible for export control, sanctions, customs. I've seen people also being responsible for logistics and ethics, and they're wearing a lot of hats with a very limited amount of resources, especially either if they have a lot of business partners or if they have more sophisticated items. They're in this gap where they have very limited resources but really high liability. So I think for companies like that, the recommendation I'm making usually is, what data do you already have? So even if it's a medium-sized organization, they should be having some form of basic master data. I don't even need to be talking about trade data necessarily, but just business data. Make sure your organizations have a proper ERP system, that they are properly tracking at least the business transactions in those kinds of systems. Because even if you're not storing all of your classifications digitally, even if you're not storing your license determination digitally, at least being able to get this oversight of the trade flows that your company is engaged in and have that oversight of your business partners and your products, that's going to be an amazing starting point. It is remarkable actually how much you can already do with this.
What about when somebody gets an alert or they see a media report, frankly, or they get a polite call from somebody from a government alerting them to some concerns they might have? How does what you guys do fit into that?
Oh, this is such a good question. So I think with most trade compliance officers, they're working unbelievably hard. So the question is, are we working hard on the right things? As things come up, can we understand what the root cause is so that I don't have to fix this problem again tomorrow? Then I think you can really get in and fix the operational process preventatively. Now, on the flip side of this, maybe something bad has already happened, and you need to understand what is the full scope of the bad thing that's happened. Secondly, what is the actual risk indicators that are occurring here, and what's related? Is it the whole trade flow lane that's the problem? Is it particular products that are at issue? Is there a specific business partner that's the concerning element here? What I like to do is really pinpoint, okay, what is my core root cause? And then what we're able to do is, once we've kind of grouped this root cause, once we've kind of grouped the issue, we now have the full list of affected transactions with all the transactional details. You click your export button on your Excel spreadsheet, you send it to your lawyer, you have a very clear scoped issue of what you're dealing with. You have all the transactional information available, and then you have that full list of affected transactions with details. Everything is clearly very scoped and organized. In that way, we're not sitting there trying to look for the needle in the haystack. We fly the magnet over, all the needles pop up. This is what we need to fix. It allows us to do a lot more with the same amount of effort.
I'm curious also, in terms of your experience dealing with a lot of different companies, what are some of the top operational snafus that you encounter that need to be sort of untangled a little bit that can unlock a lot of value for companies?
I think it's going to be the boring answer of data governance, and nobody wants to hear that because they all have bad data. But I think at the end of the day, what we need to do is stop seeing data as a hurdle for doing trade compliance. We rely on data every single day to make legally binding declarations to the government. We're making very important decisions based on that data. So I think it's not enough to just say, oh, well, I have bad classifications, I'm missing data. This goes to my second point that I mentioned earlier, which is prioritization. How do we prioritize our efforts in trade compliance to take that risk-based approach and say, if I can only fix one classification today, which one do I pick? I've done a data cleanup project in my day in industry, and you get a 550,000 list Excel spreadsheet where everything is equal. The product that's going out tomorrow to China missing a US ECCN is equal to a product I haven't sold in my company in 20 years. How is this helping me? So really where we come in and where we think about this is to say, okay, let's prioritize the bad data governance in a way that we're ranking this by operational impact. By taking this prioritized approach to data governance, you can start at the top of the list and you know that I'm having the biggest impact on my risk exposure with the least amount of effort. That philosophy translates actually into many other areas of trade compliance, like due diligence, especially when it comes to my existing business partners.
It sounds like it really comes down to a lot of blocking and tackling. It comes down to, are we doing the basic fundamentals? Are we focused on the fundamentals? Are we doing what we say we're supposed to be doing in our policies and procedures? And are we looking at this with a qualitative eye? It's like, what is really happening here? Unlocking that data and really focusing on the fundamentals to make sure that we can use that data properly can really unlock some real value.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Brent also summed this up so beautifully in helping us answer this question. Does my trade compliance program work as intended? Are people following the policies and procedures I give them? Do my technical tools work? Oftentimes I like to say we just pray to the SAP gods and hope everything is okay. But are those tools actually working the way that they should be? Or do we have misconnections or data that are difficult for a trade compliance officer to see? That's really where data moves us into this proper feeling of assurance where you do know if your program is working or not. If you have gaps, you know exactly why those gaps exist and what you need to do to fix them. More importantly, you're able to communicate that. One thing I would love to get your guys' insight on is a lot of companies come to me and they're scared of what they're going to find, right? They say, what if we open Pandora's box on our data and then suddenly we have all these things that we have to do? We've already talked about the knowledge side of this. Of course, the simple answer is, well, you technically already know about them, but that's not necessarily the emotional response of people. And at least from my perspective, I think you were still taking a risk-based approach. And I've talked to the regulators, both in Europe and the US, from various of the organizations about this, and they say it's still a risk-based approach, but it's a defensible risk-based approach because you're able to now show, here's my prioritized list, here's everything I've done, here's all the mitigating measures, and I can actually identify where I have a problem and take steps to fix that. So in my mind, it's not changing the approach of doing trade compliance. It's just allowing us to actually defend the actions we're taking. But Mike, Brent, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think you raised some good points. The U.S. government has access to data tools as well. The U.S. government, the Commerce Department, also increasingly has access to commercially available databases that provide this data. That information already is probably out there in some way, shape, or form. If there's a potential issue there, that may raise a flag from the government's perspective, and then they'll come knocking. One thing that's really kind of interesting also is Mike and I have talked about how the shift in export controls is moving to leveraging the full definition of knowledge under the EAR, which not only includes actual knowledge, but also an awareness of a high probability. All this data coming together like a mosaic. Each, kind of like you say, Erica, it's like each individual data point may not mean something, but when you take them all together, that's a clear picture. And then you're looking at issues around knowledge, which already existed in the company. They already existed in some way, shape, or form that could be found out in commercially available data sets. I like your approach in just saying, well, let's just focus on the fundamentals and take care of the root cause and fix it so it doesn't turn into an even bigger issue.
Well, we've talked about quality of data in a lot of different aspects. And one aspect, Erica, that came to mind while you were just speaking there was how good is data when we're just sending questionnaires to business colleagues? What kind of response rate are you getting? What are they doing to actually find the data? If you could just say, hey, I actually don't need any of your time. We're just going to look directly at the data, and then we're going to present to you what we think the data shows us. And then, look, if we got something wrong, then you can have that discussion. But you're not building this whole risk assessment structure on what is equally questionable data as what you might get from counterparties who also have an interest in hiding things.
Absolutely. You guys raise, I think, two very good points. And Mike, I completely agree. It's much easier to deal with the other side of the very informed conversation. We also see it really increases the engagement from the business.
And to your point earlier, Erica, how do you overcome a very natural and understandable human reaction like, do I really want to look? Do I really want to look? Isn't this just going to cause me more problems? There's a difference that's important between surfacing facts and then coming to conclusions about what those facts mean. Look, there may be facts that come up that we do have questions about. It doesn't mean we're going to immediately jump to a final assessment. The natural next thing to do is ask the business about them, but you can come armed with data. If people are particularly concerned about conclusions or analysis, well, look, there's legal privilege. If you use lawyers for that, there's other ways to do that in a way to at least protect the decision making so that you can make a decision, but you'll be making a much more informed decision. Do you have any case studies or examples you could share, anecdotes you could share about what has been effective for people trying to assure boards of directors that these issues are being well managed?
Oh, I love that. When it comes to the question of how do I assure my senior leadership that I'm covering their personal criminal liability and that I am managing my program correctly, this is really one of the core motivations for why we wanted to push some innovation in our industry so that I can really say, look, I'm not just looking at my trade process. I'm actually looking at the whole of the holistic business. I'm pulling data from my procurement system. I'm pulling from my conflict minerals team, from my logistics provider, from my brokers, from my GTS, from my ERP system, from my Salesforce. I'm actually monitoring the whole scope of the business for these kinds of risk indicators. I'm running thousands of different iterations of algorithms to catch the kind of thing that, an experienced trade compliance officer could look at and maybe have that gut feeling that something's a little off. And I'm actually able to package this in a way that is extremely actionable for the leadership to say, look, here's where our core risk exposure is. I'm doing X, Y, and Z to manage it.
You're right on with those observations. Trade compliance now is a core business asset. It's critical path for global businesses these days. So it's got to be front and center of risk management, strategic decision making, where we want to develop the business and business planning down the road. Companies that are going to miss it can run into some really big pitfalls in this day and age, driven by ever-changing geopolitical dynamics. The world where it was 20 years ago is not where it is today. These issues now have to be front and center of any company if they're going to be competitive and successful in the global marketplace today. It comes down to having a defensible program. So we all have to make risk-based decisions. We also have to stand up and defend them as well. As long as we can do that with full confidence, then, sometimes the rain comes and sometimes the rain is hard, but the building still stands. Erika, what motivated you to start your own firm? What did you see that was missing out there in the marketplace? And what were some of the big challenges along the way going from startup day zero to hero?
Oh, yeah, I think that's such a great question. Now, I loved actually my prior career. I loved being a trade compliance officer. I loved being a lawyer. I loved being a consultant in this space. But it was really difficult for me when I saw the challenges that I had as a trade compliance officer. And I had been going around the market to various service providers saying, this is my challenge. How do we deal with this? I have 37 ERP systems. I have terrible master data, yet I'm responsible for all of this. How am I going to get a handle over what's going on in the business? And then once I have that, I was being kept up at night wondering about, the plant manager that sends a laptop to China wants to go home early, so says it's a coffee cup. If we have this data, why am I not able to say, hey, why are you sending a coffee cup in a really heavy box? We've never sold a coffee cup to this person in China. Why are we selling it one? We only sell them in a pack of 100. It just wasn't logical to me that there wasn't a way to identify these kinds of risks and hopefully help me, the trade compliance officer, get more sleep. Then when I went back into private practice after having been a trade compliance officer, I started seeing these kind of worst case scenarios coming up. So many of them, you would not find them in your normal trade compliance process. That's the point. How do I best utilize my resources? How do I take a risk-based approach? These are the kinds of things that I wanted to answer, and unfortunately, nobody was tackling this at the time. So I would love to say that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but this was really something that was out of necessity, not out of desire. We needed to get over to that island over there of strategic trade compliance, and to get there, we needed a boat. So I had to build a boat, and fortunately for me, I was incredibly lucky to have met Marcus Brentscheidt, our co-founder. So if I'm the trade compliance, he's the tech. He has a background in computer science, data analytics, and process mining. I somehow convinced this poor man that trade compliance was great. Imagine that you have no budget, but you have to do all these things and you could go to jail if you mess it up. And he thought, okay, great use case. It's been incredibly interesting and fun to get to this point.
I don't think I could do a better managing up segment than this. That's a great story.
Thank you.
Necessity generates change, and it generates that necessary change. And it comes down to each one of us as an individual to find what motivates us, to find what problems that need to be fixed, because these are challenging times. There's a ton of problems that need to be fixed. But take courage, believe in yourself. And then when you do, things happen.
Well, Brent Carlson has blessed somebody else with the opportunity to do Managing Up. Erika, thank you for managing up. That was very well said.
Well said, Erika.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was an absolute pleasure.
That concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. Erika, thank you so much. We'll include all of your information in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well.
All right, be well.